Professor Wergele's here. We just got done looking at the visualizer interface. We also went through Ellipse Visualizer 1. We saw that we must implement the interface and we must define those 4 methods in order for the visualizer to work. You must also do this for your challenge. Now, there's a lot of code in the controller and you'll want to go over most of it, but this is a good real-world example for how it would be in the industry. Let's say you go to Google, you're not going to go and create Gmail from scratch. They have a program that's already been created and they want to add extra features onto it, or they want to fix up the UI. So you need to go and take what they've already have implemented and then add onto it or add a feature onto it. So this is exactly what's happening here. I'm giving you a base program and I want you to add another visualizer. So you'll need to understand how some of the methods are working in the controller, but you don't need to modify those methods. Now, if you need to modify them, you can modify them, but it's not a requirement for this challenge. So take the UI that's given to you and add your visualizer into it. That's all that we're asking you to do. That's the minimum requirements. But if you want to update the UI, you're more than welcome to. Or if you want to add some more functionality, you're more than welcome to. So you need to understand what's happening in the controller, but you don't need to modify anything in the controller to meet the challenge requirements. But again, in some cases, students needed to modify the controller and you are allowed to do so. So you'll see here I have the anchor pane and I have a media view. We talked about these two in the previous lectures in media player and the audio visual lecture. And let's go ahead and open up the view so you can see what these corresponding FXML elements are linking to. If you open up the view, this is what we have to work with. So the root is a VBox, and then I have a menu bar up at the top. The menu bar has a file option which you can select open. So you can open up a audio file or video file. And here in my visualizers, I'm going to have a list of visualizers that are going to be dynamically populated, and you can select which visualizer you'd like to see. So your visualizer will be added onto that list. And then I have the number of bands, which is a hard-coded array at this time, which can be modified for your challenge. Then I have an anchor pane. In the anchor pane, I have play and pause buttons. I also have stop. I have text for the length and labels, corresponding labels for those texts. And here I have an anchor pane. This anchor pane is the viz pane. So if I open up the code aspect, you'll see I have an FX ID of viz pane. So this is the viz pane, and this is where your visualizer will go. Now you can modify this. You can make it bigger. You can modify the display however you would like. And you'll see I have different text. Okay, this is the error. If there's an error, I'm going to display it down here. I also have the media view. If you'd like to show some videos, you can display them there. And you'll see I have different text fields for the file path or for the visualizer's name. So your get name method will return a human readable string. And I'm going to put the visualizer's name here. You'll see I have a label for bands, and I also have a slider which will be used to fast forward or rewind a song or go to a particular point in the song. So this is the default UI. This is what we're working with, and that's what the controller is linking up to. So here's the viz pane, here's the media view. You saw both of those. There's all the text, the menus, the slider. You'll see I have a media object and a media player. These two were talked about in the media play lecture as well as audio visual. You'll see the default number of bands is 40 and the default update interval is 0.05. In the previous lecture we had it at 0.01, but in this lecture I have a for loop that needs to loop through all the number of bands and update all the elements on the display. So I made the interval a little bit slower. However, you can modify that for your challenge. You'll see I have an array list. So here's a collection of visualizers. So you'll see here I'm using the interface as a type. So I'm making an array list of type visualizer, and visualizer is the interface for all 3 of these visualizers. It'll also be the interface for your visualizer. So here I'm using the visualizer as a type as well as the type of the current visualizer. So I'm using some abstraction polymorphism here. That way I can have different classes all being referenced by the same object. Okay, so this is an object-oriented concept that we've learned. You'll see I have the bands list. Right now it's from 1 to 140 at different increments. This can be changed or modified. I've seen a lot of students, their visualizer is not able to update at 140. I saw students use threads in order to make it work at 140, but that's not required. So this can be modified depending on what you're trying to do. And we're going to start writing some code here in the initialize method. Now the initialize method will create an instance of all the visualizers add them to the visualizer array list, populate the menu items. We're going to select a default visualizer, and then we're going to populate the number of bands. So let's write some code so we can get this visualizer to work, and then we'll go ahead and continue going through the controller to understand what's happening. So the first scene in the initialize method, this can be considered like the constructor. Whenever the fxml file is going to be loaded in here in the main, the controller is linked to this fxml file, and it's going to create an instance of the controller. At that time, the controller's initialize method will be called. So this is a good place to initialize objects and set up the UI. So here I'm going to set the band's text that's going to be displayed to the user with what band they've selected, and we're just going to set it to the current number of bands. But the set text requires a string, and number of bands is an integer. So in the integer class, they have a toString method. I'm going to pass in the number of bands. Now this number of bands will change, but by default it's 40 when the program is initialized. Then we need to create an instance for each visualizer. So I have the visualizers array list. You'll see it's right here on line 78. So I'm going to initialize the visualizers array list. Remember, when creating an array list, I don't need to specify the type twice. If I put visualizer here, I'll get a warning, and NetBeans says I can use the diamond notation. So I'm going to use the diamond, and then I'm going to add to this array list. I'm going to use the add method, and I'm going to add ellipse visualizer 1, 2, and 3 for now. You'll see I'm not creating an object of the visualizer and storing it to some reference. I'm actually just creating an object of the visualizer and storing it in the array list. So the array list will contain all the visualizers. Now, when you're coding your final project, you should think in this way as well. Instead of having, let's say, 3 different objects, visualizer 1, visualizer 2, visualizer 3, what happens if I add visualizer 4? Now I have to create another object, and now I have to change the code. Whereas if I have a collection to store all the visualizers, if I add another visualizer to the array list, then I don't need to modify any of the code. It's already able to accept the type visualizer, and I can add as many elements as the amount of space will allow me to. So try not to hard code elements in your program. And essentially here, instead of creating an object by hand, maybe I have a for loop. I look for all the visualizers, let's say in the visualizer package, and have a for loop and add them automatically. So I can take another step further and reduce hard coding values in my program. So try to think like this when you're implementing your final project. I'm adding ellipse visualizer 3. When you're adding your visualizer, you also need to update the code here. So once your visualizer is complete, you're going to add it here. That way it's going to be added to the menu, and users can select that from the options in the menu bar. So you see, then I have a for loop. I'm going to loop through all the visualizers. I'm going to add that visualizer as a menu item. So I'm going to create a new menu item with the visualizer's name. Get name will return a human readable string of your visualizer's name. I'm going to set the user data to the visualizer, and then whenever they click the menu item, I'm going to call the select visualizer method. You'll see here for the visualizer's menu, I'm going to get the previous items that were on the menu, and I'm going to add this new item. Okay, so this is the common procedure for adding elements on the display. Now, after we add them to the display, let's go ahead and default to a current visualizer. So the current visualizer, we're going to default that to visualizers.get the first value, so get 0. Now that's going to be visualizer 1, so you can change this part of the program. If you want to set the current visualizer to yours when the program starts, that will also be fine. Next, we're going to set the visualizer's text field. So I have a variable called visualizer name text, and we're going to set the text equal to the current visualizer get name. So remember, get name returns the human readable string. So even though get name is a very simple method, it's a very important method for this program to work. Then you'll see I loop through all the number of bands. This is an array list. So if I go up, you'll see I have my bands integer array, and I'm going to loop through. I'm going to create a menu item for each. I'm going to set the user data for the bands, and then if they click on a band, I'm going to call this method select bands, and then I'm going to add that to the bands menu. So depending on how many bands there are, I'm going to dynamically add the menu. Now you should think like this for your final project as well. Instead of me saying menu item 1, menu item 2, menu item 3, and I add all 3 menu items, I essentially have code writing code for me. If I add another visualizer here, I don't need to modify the menu item since I have a for loop that's going to add the menu items for me. And here, if I change the number of bands on the integer array, the for loop will loop through and add the menu items for me. So I don't need to add the menu items myself. Instead of saying bands, menu item 1, bands, menu item 2, and hard coding all those values, write a for loop and have code write code for you. The initialize method set up, we added the visualizers, we set the default visualizer here. We need to add a little bit more in this program to make it work, and we're going to do that in the next video. Stick with Professor Orglees. We'll see you in the next video.